Now that Jeff Ulbrich is back, the Falcons can now put in the work to take their defense to the next level.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back to another episode of Locked On Falcons, which is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, now the #1 sports podcast network in the galaxy. And of course, I'm your humble host, Aaron Freeman, been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP. Still going strong here on Locked On Falcons, entering our 2nd decade as the humble host of this podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. And on today's daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, we are continuing our offensive positional reviews, talking about the running back position, talking about how Kevin Stefanski could, boost Bijan Robinson stock into being, if he's not already RB1 in the league, he probably will be considered RB1 in the league over the next several seasons. We'll talk about Sean McDermott's surprise firing, if you want to say that, and did the Falcons mess up by not waiting to see if he would become available before hiring Kevin Stefanski. But we'll start off today's episode talking about Jeff Ulbrich's return to the Falcons. It was official. We've been talking about it for the last few days, that it was expected that this was going to be the case. But Jeff Ulbrich officially has been retained by the Atlanta Falcons, agreeing to a new 3-year deal to stay on as their defensive coordinator. We'll get into the nitty-gritty of how that impacts his defense. In 2 weeks after the Senior Bowl, when we get to the positional reviews on that side of the ball, after the Senior Bowl in that first week of February. But, we'll have a general overview of where this defense and how the arrow is pointing up. And this is a great thing because if you recall back on this podcast back in May, we talked about concerns about the long-term stability of this defense. And one of the reasons why this Falcons defense hadn't performed up to par is because they are constantly changing defensive coordinators. And that was our big worry, particularly with guys like James Pearce and Jalon Walker, who were, not going to say niche players, but were players that weren't necessarily going to have people were not going to see them universally the same. James Pearce was a great fit in the wide 9 scheme that Jeff Ulbrich was bringing to the table. Jalon Walker proved to be an excellent fit as well. And the concern was if the Falcons didn't win enough games in 2025 and it led to Raheem Morris getting fired, as it did, that, you would lose Jeff Ulbrich and you would be changing defensive schemes again. And then, you would potentially, similar to what we saw with Arnold Ebiketie, going from Dean Pease to Ryan Nielsen to, Jimmy Lake and all that stuff, and sort of that back and forth. And it's really hard to develop when you're constantly changing positions, changing schemes, all that sort of thing. So hopefully that will be a non-issue with Ulbrich under contract for the next 3 years, should be the defensive coordinator for the entirety of James Pearce and Jalon Walker's rookie contracts, along with Xavier Watts and Billy Bowman and the incomparable Jack Nelson. Jack Nelson on offense. There's not a world where Jack Nelson moves to defensive end or anything like that. No, that's crazy. But you finally have some stability. And obviously, Jeff Ulbrich could be fired. He could leave to go someplace else. So you never know. But at least for the foreseeable future, things are pointing up when it comes to that. Overall, Jeff Ulbrich did an outstanding job this year. The Falcons defense overall was about average this season. But, we talked about how that was kind of their ceiling. I think we talked about like either 16 or 18 was their ceiling. Well, if you look at DVOA, they finished 12th defensively. They finished 14th in EPA defensively. So they exceeded their ceiling in that regard. And that, to me, as we said at the beginning of the season, before the season started, if they are able to get to that somewhere around that level, that is a testament to Jeff Ulbrich coaching his butt off, and Jeff Ulbrich coached his butt off. Now, you look at the defense as a whole over the season, it was kind of an Oreo defense. If you watch the Falcons squad shows and the post games, you've heard myself and Tanitra Batiste describe the Falcons defense in recent years as that. But you saw that, right? If you look at EPA from weeks 1 through 6, the Falcons were 6th in overall EPA defensively in those first 5 games of the season when they started 3-2. Then Divine Diablo got hurt, and then they fell off a cliff. They were 28th over the next 5 games from week 7 through week 11. So that was the 49ers game through the Carolina Panthers game. They were basically a bottom 5 defense during that span of games. And then Diablo came back for that Saints game, and the Falcons defense bounced back to being 14th in EPA defensively over those last 7 games of the season. And that's probably a much more accurate portrayal of what this defense was overall in the season. And, it made sense that Stefanski was going to retain Ulbrich because Ulbrich runs a similar wide 9 4-man front scheme that Jim Schwartz has run the last 3 years in Cleveland, when the Browns defense by EPA combined over the last 3 years has been the best defense in the NFL. If you look at who was the best defense in the previous years from 2022 to 2024, it would be the New York Jets under Jeff Ulbrich and Robert Saleh. That was the best defense in those 3 years combined, according to EPA. So this wide 9 scheme, has been very effective these last, 4-ish years in the NFL, of leading some of the more successful defenses in the NFL. And with Jim Schwartz's success, Nate Ollie, coached under Jim Schwartz in Philadelphia, likely to be retained. It isn't official yet, but we suspect, we've talked about it, Nate Ollie, Mike Rutenberg, Jerry Gray are likely to be retentions on that defensive coaching staff. The question is going to be, what about, the edge rushers, Jacui Smith, the off-ball linebackers, Barrett Ruud, the secondary coach, Justin Hood? Are the Falcons going to retain some of those guys, or will they replace some of those guys? We'll sort of have to see on that front in the days and weeks to come. But, this 4-man front, this wide 9, 4-3 over, right? We saw the Falcons use the 4-2 over in their nickel front, but in their base front primarily play a 3-4 defense. And I'm wondering, will we see the Falcons lean more towards a 4-3 as their base defensive front now, without necessarily, because I feel like that 3-4 thing was a Raheem Morris sort of thing of like Jeff Ulbrich and Raheem sort of hybridizing what they wanted to do defensively. And it was like, we're going to play 3-4 base and we're going to play 4-2 over in nickel. And I wonder if they're going to now move more towards a 4-3 base and a 4-2 nickel, and maintain that now that Raheem is gone. So that will be something. And if that is the case, I've talked to some Falcon fans that are like, we need to get a nose tackle. And it's like, well, if they lean more in the 4-3 over front as their base defense, they won't really need a nose tackle at that point in time. And instead, they need to focus on getting more linebacker help, especially with Caden Ellis being a free agent and not really having a third linebacker, because they did dabble with the 4-3 in week 18 against the Saints, right? JD Bertrand came in as the third linebacker. We did see Ronnie Harrison kind of playing this hybrid safety linebacker role, in what I called their big nickel fronts, because it was kind of a hybrid role rather than a true linebacker. Ronnie Harrison did play a true linebacker role in that Carolina game next to Caden Ellis before Divine Diablo came back for the following week against the Saints game. But outside of that, it was mostly him playing this hybrid safety, basically a box safety that does some linebacker stuff, that does some safety stuff for the most part. And so we'll see if the Falcons are going to lean more in that direction. Now, I think overall defensively, cornerback is going to be a big need, especially if they're going to continue playing, this man-heavy defense that Jeff Ulbrich likes to play. That was a glaring issue this season. We'll talk more about that and how the Falcons kind of dodged like 12 bullets this year, which made their pass defense and their secondary look better than probably what it actually was, had they not had to deal with, so many key pass catchers on opposing teams like Jordan Addison and Brandon Ayuk and Tyreek Hill being out of the lineup, Devontae Adams, etc. Would have probably exposed that number 2 cornerback a lot more than what we got this season. But cornerback's going to be a big need. Getting someone who with size to help, slow down the Mike Evans and Ted McMillan in the division, to sort of contrast with AJ Terrell, who's much more capable against the quicker route runner, separator type of corners or wide receivers. You still got to work on, linebacker, cornerback. You still got to beef up the defensive rotation because you got a bunch of guys heading to free agency. And if you let those guys walk, you do have to replace them. None of those guys are like, we're talking about the Arnold Keddies and Leonard Floyds and David Onyemadas. None of those guys are like single-handedly going to doom this Falcons team, but you can't just simply go like, oh, well, we don't have to worry about those guys because they only had like 2.5 sacks this year. And so therefore they don't matter. And, I just hope the Falcons don't get complacent about their defense. Basically, long story short, but we'll get more into the nitty-gritty of all that. Is like if the Falcons get complacent about their defense, which is what they could have done and should have done, or would not should have done, not this is the wrong word, would have done, with Terry Fontenot still at the helm, which is like, oh, the defense is better, so we just got to put all our resources on the offense side of the ball. And you saw the Falcons do the opposite of that, putting all their resources on the defense side of the ball, ignore the offense, and you saw the offense decline and the defense improve. And I hope the Falcons don't make the mistake of being like, oh, well, we got to invest all the resources on the offensive side of the ball and we can ignore the defense. And you're just going to watch kind of that same gameplay be played. So we'll see if the Falcons do that. Looking forward to many a rant in March should they wind up doing that. But they still have a lot of work to do on defense, but it did absolutely, under Jeff Ulbrich, long story short, take a massive step forward with this group. And hopefully they will continue to grow as some of these young players mature and get better. And again, I love where the potential of this defense could be in 2027 when, James Pearce and Jalon Walker and Xavier Watts and Billy Bowman and, Brooke Aurora and Brandon Douglas, all these guys are hopefully at the peaks of their powers, year 3, year 4 for those guys when they're peaking as players, as we often see in this league, where this defense could be. But I hope the Falcons don't just simply say like, oh, that's all we need to make this defense. Like you have an opportunity now that if you continue to invest resources into that defense and hit on those, investments, we could be having a conversation about the Falcons being the best defense in the NFL, by EPA over some 3-year period in the very near future, if they continue to invest there. So the arrow is definitely pointing up for this defense, but they're not quite there yet, is basically the long story short. But we will continue today's episode getting into these positional reviews, talking about the running back position. Bijan is going to get paid, but what do the Falcons do with Tyler Algier and potentially replacing Tyler Algier? We'll explore all of that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. Now, the Falcons' history of hiring good coaches is not so illustrious. They always find people that look good on paper, but then they always find out in the end that maybe that guy wasn't the right fit. If only in the NFL, you had Indeed sponsored jobs. Today's sponsor to help you and NFL teams find the right match. But if you're hiring, Indeed is all you need. You don't have to struggle to get your job post seen on other sites. Indeed sponsored jobs is going to put your post at the top of the page and help you reach the right candidates faster. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs posted directly on Indeed are 90% more likely to report a hire than non-sponsored jobs. So spend more time interviewing candidates who check all your boxes with less stress, less time, and more results using Indeed sponsored jobs. Get a $75 sponsored job credit to help give your job the premium placement it deserves at Indeed.com/LockedOnNFL. Just go to Indeed.com/LockedOnNFL right now and support the show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring, do it the right way with Indeed. What if sports were traded like markets? Now you can put your sports IQ to work in real time with Robinhood Prediction Markets. It's not you against the house. It's you participating in a live market. You can buy or sell your positions live all game long. Use your sports knowledge in the moments that matter. Robinhood Prediction Markets changes the game. It's people moving the action. So when the momentum shifts, you can move with it. I always knew the game, but never had a dynamic way to apply that knowledge. Now I can actually take part live in a market powered by people. You're no longer just a spectator. Play by play, you decide. Trade every play with Robinhood, now available across the U.S. Download the Robinhood app now to begin. Futures and cleared swaps trading involves significant risk and is not appropriate for everyone. Event contracts are offered by Robinhood Derivatives, LLC, a registered futures commission, merchant, and swap firm. So before we continue today's Locked On Falcons, I want to thank each and every one of you that is an everydayer of this podcast. You are the reason why Locked On is the #1 sports podcast network in the galaxy. And then you can level up your everydayerness by joining the Everydayer Club at the link in the description below at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com for $5 a month or $50 a year. You can get some perks like an ad-free version of the audio version of Locked On Falcons, where you don't have to worry about ads and skipping ads and all that sort of stuff. And so go check it out, as well as other perks at the link in the description below. So talking about the running back position, we talked yesterday about the quarterback position. We'll continue talking about other position groups as the week unfolds. What can you say about Bijan Robinson, right? He had an outstanding year, all-pro type season. We often take Bijan for granted on this podcast because to me it's so self-evident. I've been saying this from the jump, There are two types of people on the planet. Every human being could be categorized in one of these two groups: people that are Bijan Robinson fans, and those people that haven't watched him play football yet. Not to toot my own horn, but we were very early on the Bijan Robinson hype train here on Locked On Falcons, because we were talking about him being the Falcons pick in December of 2022 when everybody else was still drinking the Tyler Algier Kool-Aid. And that's not meant to be a shot at Tyler Algier, but many people thought he was going to be like the next Nick Chubb and the next Derrick Henry. And we're like, this Bijan Robinson guy is a little bit different. And so that's part of the reason I think why we probably take him for granted on this podcast a little bit, because it's like, we've been Bijan stands for such a long time. We've been calling him Blue Magic, Mr. Walk on Water, all those various things for such a long time. And to see him have this type of season, and you're not even still getting the best version of Bijan in terms of this season. And he, had a record-breaking season for Falcons, scrimmage yards, and was 100 yards away or 200 yards, 150 yards away from breaking the all-time record in terms of scrimmage yards for any team and any player this season. So, all of this to say, Bijan's going to get paid, and the Falcons are going to have to operate. And to me, this is going to be a big factor in their decision to pay certain players, right? And this is, to me, is one of the reasons why I don't think it makes a ton of sense for the Falcons to re-sign Kyle Pitts, because you're going to pay one non-premium position in Bijan $20+ million, which is going to be what that rate is. When Bijan gets paid, we'll see. I don't think it's going to be this offseason. I think it's going to be next offseason. But it'll be interesting to see if the Falcons try to get ahead of it, if they pay him this offseason, as opposed to if he has another season like he had this year, or even a better season in 2026, that, he might be the first $25 million a year running back. Right now, I think Saquon Barkley is the only $20 million a year running back, and he's like 20 point something million dollars. And, in theory, if you paid Bijan this offseason, maybe you could get him for 21 or 22. If you wait another year, that number might go up to 25. We'll have to sort of see on that. But to me, that's one of the reasons why I'm against paying Kyle Pitts, because I'm just like, I'm going to pay Bijan, I'm going to pay Drake London. Those guys are going to be making somewhere between $55 and $60 million a year for the foreseeable future. And I got to start cutting corners financially elsewhere. And tight end is a place that I can easily cut corners at. And that's part of the reason why but we'll get more into that later this week when we talk about the tight ends. But, I think when we talk about Kevin Stefanski, and it should be great for, Bijan Robinson, because very many running backs have blossomed with Kevin Stefanski. Dalvin Cook had his breakout year in Minnesota under Kevin Stefanski. Nick Chubb broke out the year before Kevin Stefanski got there, but we saw Nick Chubb consistently be one of the top running backs in the NFL, in the top 2 or 3 running backs in the NFL for 3 years under Kevin Stefanski, with Bijan having probably 3 or 4 more years of peak prime, right? And it doesn't mean that, Bijan's going to fall off a cliff in 5 years from now, but, there's probably going to start to be a decline, 4 or 5 years from now from him. You can see a scenario where Bijan's going to consistently be, that RB1 potentially every year for the next 3 to 4 years. And that's going to be the engine of the Falcons offense. As we said, when we hired Kevin Stefanski, his success in Cleveland correlates very highly. Correlation is not causation, but correlates very highly with those Browns team having a very good run game, right? They were 3rd combined in rushing yards over the first 4 years that Kevin Stefanski was there. Those 4 years where we talked about with Stefanski, where generally the, vibes around Stefanski were positive from 2020 to 2023. And then when you look at non-scramble yards, they were 2nd in the league during that 4-year span, as we stated on Saturday. And I think we might have, the nuance wasn't there. So that's on me. But I think we made a comparison on Saturday to Kevin Stefanski and Arthur Smith. And it wasn't to say oh, they're the same. It was more that the identity of this team under Kevin Stefanski is very likely to be the same as it was under Arthur Smith, which is this run first physical football team or whatever. Now, the hope is that the play calling and the execution under Kevin Stefanski will be better than it was under Arthur Smith. And, without having done a deep dive into the Browns film yet, which is coming, but let's just say, I'm hopeful or optimistic that that will be the case once I do the film study and be like, okay, Kevin Stefanski, for those of you that missed it, like, my big beef with Arthur Smith from the jump, going back to his Titans days, was that his offense wasn't really intentional, as I call it, when it came to designing explosives. It was just kind of like, just hand the ball off to Derrick Henry or throw the short pass, intermediate pass to AJ Brown and let him cook. Which is why the Falcons invested so many resources in, skill position guys at the top of the draft to find those dudes that could make those plays for Arthur Smith. I'm hoping that when we do the deep dive on the film with Kevin Stefanski, that their offense won't be that way. And I have the expectation it won't be, but we'll sort of see if it lives up to those expectations. Now, moving on to Tyler Algier. He is a free agent this year. RB2 is going to be a need for this football team. Obviously, had they successfully developed Jace McClellan, it may be less of a need. This was the reason why they drafted Jace McClellan, so that they could let Tyler Algier walk and have someone ready to replace him, and they don't have that guy ready to replace him. And no, I don't think Nate Carter is that guy. We'll see. Maybe he balls out this summer and earns that distinction. But, I think we're going to see the team devote resources to replacing Algier as a free agent should he walk, which I'm expecting him to, but we'll see. We know that the Browns, because of how much they ran the football, similar to how the Falcons ran the football, which was one of the reasons why I was successfully able to predict them being interested in Bijan Robinson, because I knew, given Arthur Smith's proclivities of wanting to run the ball 600 times a year, you're not going to put that workload on one running back. And Stefanski's similar, where they had Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt primarily during those years. And the split between those guys was pretty even. So it wouldn't shock me if the Falcons, because of that, the value that they put on that RB2, like they did with Kareem Hunt, it wouldn't shock me if they decide to pay Algier. But, my expectation is that the Falcons will not, because they're on the verge of paying Bijan a ridiculous amount of money. I don't think the goal is to have the most expensive running back room in the NFL. Again, we're talking about, you want to sort of cut some corners a little bit financially with certain things, and you're paying a $20 million running back or $25 million running back. You want his backup to only be making like $1 million instead of $8 million or something like that, So we'll see on that front. But, I was talking to somebody earlier today who was basically talking about, the Falcons shouldn't invest in the RB2 because they have bigger fish to fry, like wide receiver. And basically my response to that person was like, that's true. You're not wrong. Wide receiver is a much, much bigger need, but it's such a big need that it's probably going to take like 2 off seasons for the Falcons to resolve their wide receiver issues fully, as opposed to they can kind of nip their running back situation in the bud if they were to hit on a day 3 pick this year. Right. And then they could just set it and forget it. And like, oh, well, we have our RB2 for the next 4 years, and we have Bijan Robinson locked up for the next, 4 or 5 years potentially. And so we don't have to worry about running back ever again. And so like, that's the benefit of, using a 6th-round pick or something like that on a running back this upcoming season. But, we'll see if the Falcons do that, or they go the free agent route, or they go the priority undrafted free agent. That may be also a possibility, because of the limited assets that the Falcons have, that they can't really solve all of their issues in one single offseason. And some of these positions, in RB2 is one of those positions that I think has a decent chance of getting punted. We'll see on that front. So let's wrap up today's episode briefly talking about Sean McDermott's firing and whether or not the Falcons messed up by not waiting a little bit longer before hiring Kevin Stefanski. So kicking off the year feeling good is the goal, right? And honestly, hydration is the easiest win for you in the new year. And I know when I stay on top of it, my energy, my focus, and my mood all level up. And if you're looking to level up your hydration, you got to try Drip Drop, a doctor-developed, proven, lasting hydration formula that helps your body and mind work together. It uses a precise ratio of electrolytes and glucose for fast absorption. It delivers 3 times the electrolytes and half the sugar of leading sports drinks, and it tastes amazing. There are 16 original flavors, 8 zero sugar options for you to choose from: passion fruit, watermelon, or some of my favorites. And right now, Drip Drop is offering our listeners 20% off your first order. Go to dripdrop.com and use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL. That's dripdrop.com, promo code LOCKEDONNFL for 20% off. Stock up now at dripdrop.com and use promo code LOCKEDONNFL. FanDuel is also one of our sponsors, and they're officially in playoff mode. Every NFL game day during the playoffs, FanDuel is giving customers even more ways to get in on the action because right now, every NFL playoff game day, FanDuel's going to let their users get a profit boost pack that's going to be waiting for you inside the app. Each game day, you can see the pack loaded with multiple profit boosts that you can apply to the bets that you like the most. Just open your profit boost pack first thing on game day and see what boost you want to apply. And, you know, these boosts are going to let you lean in on your game day instincts, whether you're looking to back the momentum, the defense, the quarterback play, or the coaching, right? If you're going to ride Jarrett Stidham this weekend, you can do that. Or if you don't want to do that, that's the beauty of the profit boost, right? It's going to be more juice to the bets that you actually like rather than forcing you to make bets that you don't. So make your picks, then apply your profit boost and go after those bigger payouts as the playoffs continue rolling. So visit FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL, and grab your profit boost pack every NFL playoff game day. So for those of you that missed the news on Monday, Sean McDermott got fired, the Bills head coach. This was something that we talked about. Again, I thought it was fascinating that we went back, like the week or two before the end of the season, and we talked about, whether or not the Falcons would keep Raheem because the buzz around this year's coaching cycle was that it wasn't a good year unless these four coaches got fired. Kevin Stefanski was one of those that we mentioned. Sean McDermott was the other one. Mike Tomlin was the other, and John Harbaugh was the other. And all four of those coaches are no longer with their teams. Three of them got fired, and one of them stepped down. So it is fascinating to me to go back and be like, oh, it all worked out in the end. But, I think there's a lot of people talking on Monday. I've seen this sentiment going around the fan base of like the Falcons should have waited to see if Sean McDermott got fired first before hiring Kevin Stefanski, and the Falcons messed up by hiring Kevin Stefanski before this. Now, I don't think that's a fair criticism because that's basically condemning somebody for not being able to predict the future. It's like, you break up with somebody and then 2 days later they win the lottery, and it's like, oh, you shouldn't have broke up with that person because how did you not know that they were going to win the lottery, 2 days later? Like, I think that's a kind of a silly criticism, but you do wonder a little bit. The natural to wonder, had Sean McDermott been fired before this weekend, would the Falcons have been as quick to secure Kevin Stefanski as their plan B option after they missed out on John Harbaugh? And, I don't know the answer to that question. I certainly think the Falcons would have been interested in Sean McDermott. As far as my personal opinion on it, like, I certainly think Sean McDermott's probably a better coach than Kevin Stefanski pound for pound, but I don't think that means that like, oh, Sean McDermott would have been a home run hire for the Falcons. Now, I think it would have been a lot less polarizing than the Kevin Stefanski hire because a lot of, the Kevin Stefanski hire is going to be polarizing. Similar to Raheem Morris hire was polarizing. I don't think the Arthur Smith hire was as polarizing. I'm sure there were people that were not fans of that hire at the time, but I would say in general, my recollection back in January 2021 was that people thought the Falcons got that right for the most part. But these last two hires have been polarizing, and people, if Stefanski wins, people it'll quiet the criticism, right? It's not going to make it go away. It's just going to be people just waiting in the wings, waiting for Kevin Stefanski to mess up and then to be like, see, I told you so, right? That's how that always works. Winning doesn't change people's minds. It just makes them go quiet. And so we'll see on that front. So, for me, like Sean McDermott, yes, I think Sean McDermott is a better coach pound for pound than Kevin Stefanski. I still think a lot of the challenges of the Falcons, it still wouldn't have been like a home run hire because it's like, okay, well, who's going to be Sean McDermott's OC, right? It's the same conversation we have with any defensive-minded head coach where like who your OC, who your quarterback is going to kind of break you. And that's true of Kevin Stefanski as well. It's just you kind of know the OC situation. That's one less box you have to worry about getting checked because he can call the plays on that. And so it's really just a question of who's going to be your quarterback. And then on top of that, it was like, who's going to be your defensive coordinator at that point in time, which is less of a concern just because of my general belief, for those of you that are new here, that, the X's and O's matter less on defense than they matter on offense. It doesn't mean that they don't matter at all on defense. As I said at the top of the show, Jeff Ulbrich coached his butt off, and his scheme, to me, was a big part of the Falcons' success, particularly when it came to the pass rush. But at the same time, as we talked about at the top, like a lot of your success defensively is just like the Jimmies and Joes rather than the X's and O's. And if you don't have the guys that can match up, if you don't have the horses, then it doesn't really matter. But that being said, like, and again, I say that to basically explain why, like, in general, my perception is, and a lot of people agree with me on this, that's why it's a little bit better to hire an offensive-minded head coach, because like the obstacle that you have to overcome schematically on defense is it's a smaller hill, right? It's a smaller mountain that you have to climb as opposed to offensively. And that's what pushes people towards, over hiring offensive-minded head coaches. And so that being said, even though I think Sean McDermott, all things being equal, is a better coach than Kevin Stefanski, I don't know if, in a world where the Falcons knew that, his firing was coming, that hiring him would have magically solved a lot of their issues. And the last point I'll say is, because I think regardless of who the Falcons head coach is, I think most of their problems, their success doesn't just hinge on hiring a great head coach. We're not going to get into it here at the end of the show, but like, I think there's a lot of rhetoric surrounding this team that suggests that the only problem with this team is that their coaching was bad. I don't think their coaching was as bad as some people portrayed it. I don't think their coaching was good last year, but I also don't think it was awful. I don't think you have 3 all-pro caliber players on offense, with Bijan and Kyle. And if Drake London had been healthy for the entire season, he probably would have been an all-pro as well. And you get basically 3 guys at your key skill positions all having basically career years, and think that, Zach Robinson's a terrible play caller. Zach Robinson's a middling play caller, but he's always been a middling play caller. And frankly, my controversial take of the day is like, he was a better play caller in 2025 than he was in 2024. I'll absolutely die on that hill. To me, a lot of the shortcomings of the team had things that had nothing to do with Zach Robinson, right? And we'll talk about that probably tomorrow on the episode when we talk about the wide receiver stuff. But that to say, the point of me saying that is, I could think the Falcons' success hinges on their ability to solve their quarterback issues, to revamp their skill positions, to rebuild their offensive line, to continue building up their defense. And that wouldn't have changed regardless of who the head coach is. And so that's why, like, I sit here and I go, like, who they hire as a head coach matters. It absolutely does, right? It's going to help determine the outcomes of football games, because the head coach matters on game day. But like, you got to put that head coach, regardless of it's Sean McDermott, Kevin Stefanski, John Harbaugh, whoever, you got to put that guy in a position to be able to handle that stuff on game day by giving him the roster that he needs to have success. And I think when you look at Kevin Stefanski's downfall in Cleveland, you can argue Sean McDermott's downfall in Buffalo. I won't necessarily argue Raheem Morris's downfall was because of Terry Fontenot, but essentially what I'm arguing is all of these guys got undermined because their teams were not good at the drafting and free agency, and they didn't get better from a roster standpoint. And to me, that's going to matter a lot for this Falcon team, that if they're going to have success and sustainable success for the near future, they're going to have to get better in terms of from a talent standpoint. They're going to have to get better from a coaching standpoint. And I don't think Kevin Stefanski, Sean McDermott, like, I don't think there's one coach out there that like, oh, well, this guy is a great coach and he would have solved their problems, and these other guys weren't a great coach. Like, circumstances matter and all that stuff. But those are my thoughts on that. So I think it's fair to wonder, how things would have been different if, Sean McDermott had gotten fired a week ago as opposed to today. But, I'm not going to lose too much sleep over it. I wish Sean McDermott the best. I felt like he got a raw deal in Buffalo these last couple of years, and got far too much criticism for some of the shortcomings of that team. Where I feel like Sean and Josh, and Josh, turned the ball over 4 times the other day. Tough break for my guy, Josh Allen. But I felt like Sean and Josh were the 2 guys that were the good things for the Bills, and everything else was questionable. Maybe not everything else, but a lot of other things were questionable for that team. And so we'll see if getting a new coach in there, shakes things up enough to get that team to where they want to be, which is winning Super Bowls in the near future. But go check out Locked On Bills if you want to get more insight into that. Continue to check us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Tomorrow we'll get into that wide receiver position and give you any updates on any other ongoing breaking news for the Atlanta Falcons. Check out Locked On NFL if you want to get the scoop on, the fallout of the McDermott firing, the latest with all the coaching searches. Still got 8 openings now. So go check that out, Locked On NFL. And of course, check out the Everydayer Club at the link in the description below, lockedonfalcons.supercast.com, $5 a month or $50 a year. You get an ad-free version of the audio version of this podcast, as well as other perks like a Locked On Podcast Network, Discord access, as well as merch for Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.